right is still right, even if you stand by yourself.
Mr. Chief Justice, may it please the court.
It is Thursday, February 6, 2025. Welcome to Case in Point, the legal show for regular people. I am your host, as always, Sarah Parshall Perry, here at the Heritage Foundation, making the law accessible, pared down, without the policy wonk speak, not a bunch of Washington lawyers talking to each other. This is a show for you. Why? Because the law matters, and there is a lot going on in the law. In fact, let me tell you about two new review grants just up at the Supreme Court. Now, we don't know when we'll hear them yet, but these are two cases that implicate parental rights, religious liberty, education, and gender identity curriculum, okay? Now, we've got porn, free speech, social media regulation, gender medicine bans for minors, state funding restrictions for abortion, and ghost gun regulation. The justices are killing me right now, okay? First cert grant, case called Oklahoma Charter School Board versus Drummond. Are religious public charter schools constitutional? Big question. We know obviously how the Supreme Court has ruled on questions about whether or not private religious schools are entitled to government benefits. And the answer is yes, they are. But this is the first time the justices are going to be faced with a question about charter schools, which by their very nature are generally organized under state law. The question here, does a state violate the Constitution's First Amendment free exercise clause, again, free exercise of religion, by excluding privately run religious schools from the state's charter school program just because they're religious? Or does that state violate the other clause in the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause, prohibiting the government from establishing an official religion? We're going to find out. We don't know when oral arguments are scheduled yet, but we know briefing is underway. And the second big cert grant, and this is a big one. It covers a lot of the work that I do here at the Heritage Foundation. It's a case called Mahmoud versus Taylor. It came up from the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals from the Maryland County District Court. What we're looking at in this case is a question about whether or not a group of Maryland parents, and again, Montgomery County schools are the biggest school district in the state of Maryland, can they opt their children out of LGBTQ-themed curriculum because it's a violation of their religious liberty and their right to bring up their children in their religious faith? All of these parents, and they are both Eastern Orthodox, they are Muslim, they are Protestant, they are Roman Catholic, they've all alleged that this particular view of human sexuality and gender identity violates their sincerely held religious beliefs. Now, the courts have said for years that there's no what's called cognizable interest, right? There's no recognized interest that a parent has to say really anything about school curriculum. And generally, they hold that when a student is dropped off at the public school doors, a parent loses a right to make determinations on things like dress code or school administration or even curriculum. But they have not yet seen a case where that particular curriculum directly conflicts with the religious beliefs of the parents of minor children. And by the way, these are kids as young as 3 or 4. Now, again, this puts the justices right at the crux of the culture wars. Again, I've mentioned some of the other cases that we're seeing, and everything from porn to gun rights to free speech to Medicaid coverage for abortion. And it just came 6 weeks after the justices heard oral arguments in U.S. versus Scarametti. And you all will remember, we talked about it here. We've had the Tennessee Attorney General, Jonathan Scarametti, on this show. That's the case out of the Supreme Court that is specifically related to the constitutionality of Tennessee's gender medicine ban for minors. A lot of us thought that they were done with even incidental consideration of gender identity this term, but I guess they aren't, and it's made this particular term even hotter. Now, while this case has not been scheduled yet for oral arguments, it's possible they could squeeze it onto the docket in April. That would require truncating, shortening the actual briefing schedule and hurrying things up a little bit to get all of the oral arguments and the briefings in before they issue a decision at the end of June or beginning of July. What's a likelier possibility is that they'll probably hear this case next term, and what they decide to do with their docket is anyone's guess. Now, we're in a lull right now. The Supreme Court will not hear any more oral arguments until the week of February 24th. But on the Wednesday of that week, there's another interesting case that we're going to be talking to the attorneys about, Ames versus Ohio Department of Youth Services. Now, we all remember Bostock versus Clayton County in 2020, and that's the case where the Supreme Court specifically said that discrimination on the basis of sex in employment includes discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. Why? Because, as Justice Gorsuch wrote, sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation are, quote, inextricably linked with one another. They are connected in a way where you have to consider sex before you get to the question of sexual orientation or gender identity. Well, now the equation is turned on its head. In this case, this is a heterosexual woman who's claimed she was passed over for two less qualified employees, one who was a lesbian woman, one who was a homosexual man. Now, she's what the court has called a member of a majority class. In other words, heterosexuals make up a greater portion of the population. And so she has to prove that she works for an employer who is that unusual type employer that discriminates against the majority of individuals as opposed to the minority. So what are the background circumstances that she has to demonstrate to support the suspicion that she was discriminated against? Big questions. But that will be heard on February 26th at the end of this month. We'll talk about that case further on in these episodes of Case in Point. But today, I'm going to be talking about elections. Now, many of you probably have, as I do, still a bit of an election hangover. It was wild and wonderful here in D.C., but it was chaotic. Ceremonies were moved indoors. Everyone had to adjust on the fly. But we do know that elections obviously have consequences. We saw that play out in real time. I'm going to be talking to a man named Michael Maibach, and he's the Distinguished Fellow on American Federalism at the Save Our States organization and the founder and director of the Center for the Electoral College. He wants to talk about something called the National Popular Vote movement. What is it? And according to Michael, is it actually a threat to our democracy and closer to complete enactment than we think? That and more on today's episode of Case in Point. Today, I'm talking with Michael Maibach, who is the Distinguished Fellow on American Federalism at the Save Our States organization. And he's also the founder and director of the Center for the Electoral College. Now, he's got a resume as long as my arm, but for purposes of our discussion today, those will be two of his most compelling titles and affiliations. Michael, welcome to Case in Point.
Thank you. Honored to be here, Sarah. Appreciate it.
So we're going to talk a little bit today about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Now, that's a mouthful, but we can call it MNPV for short. And I want to talk a little bit about why this is really a threat to our democracy, because you've written and spoken on this a great deal. And I don't think our viewers and listeners at home understand exactly what's at stake with this issue. So can you describe to us what the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is?
Yes. History is always important. And in 2000, we had the Bush v. Gore contest, and it was decided by the Supreme Court, as you know, after
the infamous hanging chads, right?
And there was a man named John Koza, who's an engineer. He has the patent on the scratch-off lottery ticket. So he's a very successful, wealthy senior citizen in California. He hired two political science professors to come up with a way to get around the amendment to the Constitution by having something that legislatures could pass without getting rid of the Electoral College through a constitutional amendment called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And the idea is to have state legislatures pass this legislation, have governors sign it, and when they have 270 electoral votes, which is what it takes to elect a president.
Right.
So it started in 2006. Save Our State started in 2009, and our goal is to oppose this in legislative testimony and lobbying and speaking with people like you and doing other communications around the country. The 17 legislatures have now passed the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, the NPV, and they have 209 electors.
Wow. So considering we need 270 to win any presidential election, we're actually closer to this than I think a lot of our viewers and listeners might ordinarily understand.
Right. The good news is they're running out of all blue states. Maybe I should tell you what it does.
Please.
And then we can talk about the 17 states and all the rest. What it says is we, the state government, will decide no matter how the voters of our state vote, whomever wins the national popular vote at the end of the presidential election, we will tell our electors to vote for that person when they go to the state capitals in Richmond, Virginia, or Sacramento, or any other state capital that's passed this resolution. We'll tell them to vote for that, even if it's against the will of our own voters. It's quite an affront to the population of each state. But this is not stopped this cause. The MPV legislation has only been passed in state governments where the House, the Senate, and the governor are all of one party. And while Save Our States is a nonpartisan organization, this is a project of the Democratic Party because 99% of the state legislators who have voted for this are Democrats, and 100% of the 17 governors are Democrats.
Oh, so it would seem to be sort of partisanly inclined, which actually, to my mind, automatically raises the specter of political malfeasance, right? And one of the questions I was going to ask you, Michael, is whether or not the Electoral College favors one political party or another. Because we've heard, and I'll play devil's advocate here, that the Electoral College favors one particular political party, but you've actually argued it doesn't.
So since 1904, we've had 14 Democrats and 15 Republicans, including the most recent election, elected president. So until this last election, it was 14 and 14. So there is no favoring of one party or the other. It's remarkably miraculous, the founder system, which has come up with this sort of even-handed form of selecting our president. And by the way, we only have 2 parties in America because of the Electoral College. The average European country has 9 parties. And we could talk about that, but it's a great strength of a country, especially with 300 and some million people, to have 2 parties and not 12 parties.
Yeah, absolutely it is. So we hear a lot about the national popular vote and the importance of the popular vote. And we hear a lot of pundits who have a tendency to lean left, arguing for the simplistic adoption of a national popular vote. But that's actually not what the NPV Interstate Compact is it?
It is not a national popular vote in the sense that there is no person or government agency that accumulates all those votes. Only the Congress, for 8 weeks after the election and the electors have voted, does the Congress accept those electoral votes. Those that are for this say, well, the majority should always rule. And so I say, if we got a deal for you, we have 50 Democratic votes, and then we aggregate those. And this is much more democratic than virtually every other republic in the world, which uses a parliamentary system, which means their prime ministers are never on the ballot of all their citizens.
So I've got a question for you. Do you find NPV to be itself legal? I don't know if we've ever seen this particularly challenged in court, but do you think it's legal at all?
Two or three reasons. One is there's the compact clause of the Constitution. Remember that there were in the 1787 convention in Philadelphia, there were 9 states with very low population and 4 with very high population. Virginia was just the biggest state in terms of population. Pennsylvania had Philadelphia, the largest city, New York City, and Boston, and Massachusetts included Maine at the time. Those were the big 4. The others were very small in population. Virginia, 750,000 people. Georgia, 75,000, 1/10. You get the idea.
Yeah.
Nation of the big states against the small. Matter of fact, when they went to Philadelphia with Jimmy Madison and George Washington, 2 Virginians, including the man that won the Revolution, Rhode Island didn't even send delegates to Philadelphia, so much they were afraid the Virginians were going to take over the country.
Wow. That
states can't bundle together certain actions that change the Constitution without the 3/4 vote of the states, and compacts to get around the Constitution have to be approved by the U.S. Congress, including the Senate, where every state has 2 votes. So it's unconstitutional in that sense. It also is probably unconstitutional because of the Equal Protection Clause of the 5th and 14th Amendments, because we have early voting in different times in different states. We have ballot harvesting in some states. We have, I think it's 22 states that don't require voter ID, and on and on. We have so many different types of voting rules that there is no equal protection of the voting laws in our country. And finally, the state constitutions of Virginia, Michigan, and others say that only the voters of our state can elect our public official. Well, if California's 40 million people are going to decide the electors of Virginia over the will of the people in Virginia, well, they're electing the electors rather than Virginians. And so this is not constitutional. This is really about chaos, constitutional chaos, because it won't be attested in the Supreme Court until election night when they triggers the 270.
So with 17 states and the District of Columbia already on the line who have moved forward with this national popular vote compact, I found this very interesting. I did a little research. If a state's electoral college votes have to go to the winner of the national popular vote in this last election, which we know was significant because Donald Trump won not only the electoral college, 312 electoral college votes, but also a plurality of the national popular vote. But if we had followed the interstate compact for the popular vote, states such as California, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, Colorado, Minnesota, and Massachusetts would all have had to give their electoral college votes to Donald Trump in this past election. Probably not what they would have wanted in the outcome. And I think also what surprises me is sort of the relationship to population density. You talked a little bit about this with the framers and the original forming of the Constitution at the convention. 83% of Americans live in urban areas, but that just constitutes 3% of U.S. land areas. So the Electoral College, obviously, in the states, elects the president. It requires the winner to win the country, not just simply sort of cherry picking those favorable voters and ignoring the rest. So it's really just the Electoral College is a fairly ingenious system.
Oh, it is brilliant. Hamilton writes, I think it's in Federalist 78, if it is not perfect, it is at least excellent. States have half of our people. Los Angeles County has more people than 41 of our states. New York City, more people than 39 of our states. You get the idea.
Yeah.
Around the country, one of the things I show is a picture of Central Park. And I ask my audience how many acres. Well, they don't know, but it's 843. How many of those acres are farmed? Oh, no, we walk our dogs there. We We jog there. We play baseball there. We fish there. We don't farm Central Park. And yet you can see the Whole Foods store in Manhattan full of produce and wonderful foodstuffs. And then I show a picture of an Iowa farm. And I say, maybe this is why we start our primaries, presidential primaries in Iowa, because they feed the cities.
Yeah.
Person for a year, which means if Central Park was farmed, it could feed 136 people a year, not 9 million.
Wow. All right, so let me ask you a question, Michael. Where has the sort of political party divide come down on the national popular vote movement? You've talked a little bit about how it's got these roots, the foundations that appear to be very aligned with democratic ideals. What are some of the organizations behind this, and has the Republican Party ever taken a stance on the national popular vote compact?
Yes, the Republican Party in their various platforms at the presidential level are for the Electoral College, and I'm not aware of any major Republican personage or office holder that's against the Electoral College. The Democratic platforms have been silent on this issue. However, most leading Democrats are for getting rid of the Electoral College. Hillary Clinton, for example, Barack Obama, others. Joe Biden was always silent. You know, he's from Delaware. He's always been silent on this issue. But Mrs. Harris was for getting rid of it. So it's it's really a project of one party, and I'm chagrined about that because my business is only to talk about the Constitution, not to be partisan at all.
Sure. And where does some of the funding come from for a movement like this? What are some of the organizations behind it?
Well, besides the National Popular Vote Compact staff, and very well funded, Mr. Koza and others in California fund it. But there's other, won't mention them all here, but there are other funds like Mr. Soros, you can get the idea, who fund groups that fund this, like One Vote, if you know what that is.
Yeah.
That are supportive of this idea and very well funded. They go to state legislatures and fly them to the Caribbean for weekend conferences to talk them into this. Save our states, we will buy somebody breakfast if we can afford it that day. So we don't fly anybody anywhere. So it's very well funded from New Yorkers and Californians primarily. And just a few $1 million a year really has high impact.
Yeah.
They're running out of blue states, as I said, but there are target states. If we want, we could talk for a minute about the target states that they're looking at.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about those target states, because we hear obviously in every election season. And, you know, I think for those of us here at Heritage Foundation, many of us still have election hangover. There was a lot of work going into November of 2024. We're so gratified that we feel in many respects it was a restoration of the rule of law. And I'm particularly interested to hear your perspective on which states this particular movement is focusing on and why they feel those states are important.
Yeah, well, we're concerned about Virginia, where I live, when we have a new governor. If we have a Democratic governor, the Winston Sears, the lieutenant governor, would not be for this, and she would veto it. But the state legislature in Virginia is all of one party, and they already a couple times have passed this, but they've not gotten to the governor's desk, I guess I would say. Michigan is an all-blue state, and we're concerned about Michigan. They had it teed up right after the election. It looked like the legislature was going to send it to their governor, who would have signed it. But when the president won Michigan, it was kind of hard to make the argument for national popular vote. When the legislation was put on hold. But Michigan is another one. In Nevada, because we've stopped it in the normal process of the legislative area, they're proposing a constitutional amendment in Nevada, and that will be before the legislature this year. So we'll have to watch that one. There's a couple of other states that we're concerned about longer term, I guess I would say, that maybe would go all Democratic. But Arizona is one of them that we would watch. Right now, it's a mixed government, as you know. But I think those are the key ones. Virginia, once we have the November election this year, if we don't have the Republican come in. I know Glenn Youngkin, the governor of Virginia, has told me personally he would veto this if it came to him. And so they won't send it to him, I don't think.
You've actually argued that the NPV interstate compact would actually allow non-citizens and potentially minors to vote. Can you tell me how that would work? Well,
on the non-citizen issue, California passed a law, the legislature, this last year, that it is illegal for election officials to ask for ID.
Yeah.
We just had 4 years of open borders, and an awful lot of people went into California.
Yeah.
And they allow, by law, ballot harvesting in California, which means you can go door to door and help people fill out their ballot. You
Sure.
can go to nursing homes and do that. So without any voter ID in that state or other states, let's say New Jersey or New York doesn't require voter ID. It makes it very problematic when you have an open border. In terms of minors, we do have some cities now that allow for under 18 voting.
Yeah.
That the ballots are only local, that they're given. But I think the main thing is the illegal, not non-citizen, put it that way. This is one of the great things about the Electoral College. At the end of my speech, I talk about the sinking of the Titanic because I want to keep it very positive as I end the speech. And I show a picture of this Titanic going down in 2 hours and 30 minutes. And I ask the viewers, remember when it hit the iceberg, the designer of the ship in the movie, but in real life, showed them that to save money, they didn't close the compartments.
Right.
And therefore, the water would spill over. And he looked at his watch, 2.5 hours, this will sink. And it did sink. That's what happened in real life. When we had the Florida recount in 2000, 49 states stood back and watched the sealed compartment of Florida recount because the other 49 were sealed.
Yeah.
Sink like the Titanic because we have 50 sealed compartments. This is all by way of saying if there's a lot of illegal voters in California, they'll only have the electoral votes they have. It won't spill over and dilute the votes of other people that are legal citizens in America. So the ingenious nature of the Electoral College also guards against fraud that affects the whole country rather than just one state.
That's a great analogy. I love that picture of sealed compartments. That makes a lot of sense for people who are not in the electoral law space. So speaking of sort of being in that legal space, have we seen any litigation over these efforts to drive NPV compacts across the country?
That's a good question. You know, I'm not a lawyer, you are. You have to case it.
Yeah.
And until the compact goes into effect, which would be on election night if they ever have 270 electors, there is no case in controversy because nothing has gone into effect. And so it's designed, ironically, to click in on the presidential campaign night, the election, and it will go immediately to the Supreme Court for appeal. Most likely the court would say, I'm sorry, you can't go around the Constitution this way.
Yeah.
To say, isn't this Supreme Court undemocratic? We need to pack it, right? So
Right.
You have to understand that very often the goal is actually chaos.
Yeah.
But we find the left usually tries, rather than change their policies, they keep changing the rules until they always win.
That's it.
What we want to do is stick to the Constitution. It takes 38 states to change the Electoral College. Thank you very much.
Yep.
And You're not going to get them because most of those states are like Iowa or New Hampshire or, North Dakota that don't have a lot of people. The one thing I wanted to mention for our audience is I often use the World Series as an example. As you know, it's best out of 7 games.
Yep.
Everybody knows that. And I like to use 1960 World Series, although nobody in the audience is old enough to remember the World Series in 1960, but it was Pirates against the Yankees. It's very famous because the bottom of the ninth, the last game, Bill Mazeroski hits a walk-off home run, bats in a couple extra runs, and wins the World Series. Very dramatic thing because one hit of the bat and it's over. So I asked people, is that fair? The Pirates had 4 games, the Yankees had 3, and they say, of course, that's the rules. And I say, did you know in those 7 games, the Pirates had a total of 27 runs, and the Yankees had a total of 55 runs, more than twice as many runs. Is that fair? And, of course, it is fair because it's just like in basketball, the Final Four in basketball, it's not the most points, it's the most games.
That's it.
The most points, they don't add up all the interceptions and the touchdowns, they add up the games. And so we have 50 games called elections, and then we aggregate those just like the World Series, and we say we have a winner because every state is a sovereign state for their own elections. It's really an ingenious system.
All right, so one last question for you, Michael. What are you doing next? We're still relatively on the cusp of a brand new year. Where are your efforts this year at Save Our States going to be most focused?
So Michigan, Nevada, will be probably top 2. We will be monitoring other states. We are talking to some legislators about passing, in Utah, for example, a constitutional amendment that says national popular vote would be unconstitutional in the state of Utah, to seal it into their constitution. So we're talking to them. Other states, we're talking to legislators about passing resolutions saying the state of X rejects the idea of national popular vote, and we're on record, the House and Senate, maybe the governor signs a resolution of some type. So we're trying to do some things against that. And we are talking in one state, I won't mention it, one state that passed the NPV compact, we're talking to legislators about introducing a bill to remove that from their books. And so we'll see how that goes.
So you have your work cut out for you, it seems.
If I could just mention, we have just 5 of us at Save Our States, and my colleagues do a lot of the retail door-to-door and with legislators and online things. My job is to give speeches and to do things like this. So if you have anyone in your audience that believes in free speech, I have a free speech. And we go all over the country. I've spoken in 22 states now, and happy to come to their community or do it online with them.
Michael Maibach, Distinguished Fellow on American Federalism at the Save Our States organization and founder and director of the Center for the Electoral College. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for your constitutional loyalty. It is a boon, I think, to those of us who work in the field of law to know that while this menace is sort of percolating in the background, your organization is doing everything it can to fight it. Thank you so much for joining me today on Case in Point. Well, that's it for this February 6th edition of Case in Point, the legal show for regular people. I hope you enjoyed yourself, learned something, were possibly entertained, and realized a little bit better why the law matters and matters to you. Share this podcast with your friends on all of our podcast platforms, Apple to Spotify to Rumble. Follow us for sure on X at Case in Point Pod. And be sure to pass this around to friends and family in your life that could use a little law. But until then, friends, court's adjourned.